Hi, Mr. Right here, and in this film we are going to look at how to use the rules of indices or the rules of powers. And let's start off by understanding these four things. First of all, what does a power, what does an indice mean? Well, if you had x to the power of 4, then that would mean x times x times x times x. Or alternatively, if you had the expression 7 times 7 times 7, that could be written as 7 to the power of 3, which we call 7 cubed. So that's what a power means. Now, what happens when you multiply expressions with powers? Let's have a look, for instance, at x cubed multiplied by x squared. Now, to understand this, you'll want to remember what x cubed means. Well, x cubed means x times x times x. So that's the x cubed, and we're timesing that by x squared. So we're going to multiply that by x times x, because that's the x squared. Now, what have I got all together there then? I've got x times x times x times x times x. X to the power of 5. So when you multiply expressions with indices, you add the powers. Okay, now let's have a look at what happens when you divide. So let's consider this. Let's consider d to the power of 6 divided by d squared. Well, you're probably thinking, if when you multiply you add the powers, when you divide you probably subtract the powers. So I'd have d to the power 4 there, 6 minus 2, and you'd be correct. Now, why is that? Well, if we have d to the power of 6, d times d times d times d times d times d, there's d to the power 6. If I'm now going to divide by d squared, well, why would I bother to multiply by those last two d's if I'm just going to divide by them? Because one will cancel the other out. So you can see that I started with d to the power of 6, but by the time I've cancelled out those last two d's, I only have d to the power of 4 left. So when you divide expressions with indices, you subtract the indices, or you subtract the powers. Now, what about when you have something with a power and it's raised to another power? For instance, what about if I have x cubed and I raise that to the power of 4? Well, let's have a think about what that means. X cubed to the power of 4 is this something to the power of 4. So it's this something multiplied by this something, multiplied by this something, multiplied by this something. There it is, x cubed to the power of 4. And now, if I use my first rule of indices, I'm multiplying here. So I'm going to add the powers. 3 plus 3 plus 3 plus 3 is 12. So you can see what's happened here is that I've had x to the power of 3, and that's been raised to the power of 4, and I've ended up with x to the power of 12. So the rule, when you have something with a power raised to another power, is that you multiply those two powers there. So x to the power of 3 raised to the power of 4 is x to the power of 12. So that is what a power means, what happens when you multiply expressions with powers, what happens when you divide expressions with powers, and what happens when you have an expression involving a power which is raised to another power. Now, here are a couple of things to look out for. First of all, anything to the power of 0 equals 1. So x to the power of 0 would be 1. Or 3a squared b to the power of 0 would be 1. And secondly, this is what I call all of me squares all of you. And there's a song that sounds a bit like that. If you had this, 3a to the 4, b to the 3, and you squared it, then you need to remember that all of me squares all of you. What we're going to do is we're going to square each thing in the bracket. So we're going to have 3 squared times a to the power of 4 squared times b cubed squared, which is going to give us, well, 3 squared is 9. A to the power of 4 raised to the power of 2. Remember to multiply those. Gives me a to the power of 8 times b to the power of 3. B cubed to the power of 2 is b to the power of 3 times 2 is 6. So we'd end up with 9, a to the 8, b to the 6. Similarly, if you have something like this, 4x squared y cubed, you have to remember that all of me cubes all of you. So, what do you need to remember? Well, you need to remember your rules of indices. You need to remember that when you multiply expressions with powers, such as a to the power of 7 multiplied by a cubed, you add the powers. So that will be a to the power of 10. You need to remember that when you divide expressions involving indices, a to the power of 7 divided by a cubed, that you subtract the indices. So that one will be a to the power of 7 minus 3, a to the power of 4. And you need to remember that when you have an expression which involves a power and it's raised to another power, you multiply those indices together. So this is going to be a to the power of 7 times 3, a to the power of 21. Now, this skill, using indices, working with indices, requires lots of practice, so you'll want to be looking out for the practice film in this program.